Okay, so hi everyone. I would like to use this opportunity to welcome you all to our first seminar of 2025. I'm in the person of John Baglico, a PhD student at the University of Rwanda and also at AIMS. And I'm a core team member of the AfriClimate AI community. I would just give a brief intro about the community and then about the speaker for today, and we can dive in. So at AfriClimate AI, we aim to create a vibrant community of students, researchers, professionals, and policymakers who collaborate, innovate, and drive forward the development and application of AI to support regional and continental climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies. So we do run several projects, and notable among them is the AfriNet initiative, which basically seeks to set up low-cost automatic weather stations across the continent and to develop data APIs, which would significantly bolster the continent's capacity for accurate and localized climate data collection. So recently, this project was a winner of the Deep Learning in Dabes 2024 Ideathon, which is worth mentioning. I think we should clap for the team who worked on the project. And we also have a benchmarking project, and its goal is to create a comprehensive framework for evaluating weather forecasting models over Africa by using baseline data sets and performance metrics. And of course, this seminar series is one of the activities of the community, and it's targeted at promoting knowledge sharing and collaboration within the growing community. So today's seminar is titled Open Benchmarking to Drive S2S Weather Intelligence in East Africa. And Genevieve would be leading this session. And so just a bit about the speaker for today. So Genevieve is a co-founder and executive director of RISA Research, which is a non-profit organization developing open technology to serve people and the planet. And she currently leads the Gates Foundation funded SheerWater Project, which basically works to address global inequity in weather forecasting with a focus on providing actionable insights for smallholder farmers in East Africa. I would, yeah, she has done a lot of things, but for the sake of time, I would go ahead to mention some housekeeping rules and then we can get started. So unless you are speaking, I would entreat you to mute your microphone so that we will have a free flow of the event. And unless the speaker would like interruptions, you can note down your questions, and once she's done, you will be able to ask them. Or you can also type it in the chat section, and we will read them after. And of course, we would like to say that there should be respect for one another within the score. There should be no bullying whatsoever. And with that, I would give the floor to the speaker. So Genevieve, your audience, your speaker. The floor is yours.
Thank you, John. And I'll just say I'm really delighted to be giving a seminar to this group of folks. I met one of AfriClimate AI's core team leads, Rendani, at New York Climate Week this year, and was just really inspired by his vision of enabling and empowering and pulling together this network of students from all over the continent. And something that I'll talk about in my seminar today is just, I think we're in a totally new era for weather and climate data. The tools are really usable, the data sets are open, there's this kind of accessibility and capacity to play with weather and climate data to try to improve forecasts where you live, using the data around you. that is new, I think, in this moment in time. And so I'm really excited to see more students, more folks, more professionals engaging in weather and climate forecasting prediction. And I'll kind of talk about how I see that system and the role that I think benchmarking and open data sets and kind of this type of activity can play in it. So I'm excited to talk to you all today. And I'll try to get my slides up. Does everyone see that okay, John? Is it coming through?
Yes, you can see it.
Let me just hide. Bars. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so I am going to talk today about open benchmarking to drive subseasonal to seasonal S2S weather intelligence in East Africa. And I wanted to start this talk with a kind of story about a specific place, because I think that will be really the ongoing theme of this talk, is that as we think about this next generation of forecasting technology, weather intelligence, there really is the capacity to think about highly localized forecasts for specific tasks. And I'm going to look at East Africa, specifically Kenya, for agricultural tasks, and kind of talk about how this new focus on very local, very task-specific forecasting has the potential, I think, to unlock a lot of benefit to communities and farmers across the world. So we're going to start the story today in Machakos County in Kenya. And if anyone on this call lives in Machakos and I say anything wrong, please correct me here. No, but this is my understanding. So if you live in Machakos County, there is a large probability that you're a smallholder farmer. 58% of households in Machakos County are smallholder farmers. This is a semi-arid region in Kenya. It's at a kind of moderate to high elevation, 1,200 meters above sea level. And this is kind of what the landscape looks like. So you're farming in an arid high elevation area here, just a bit east of Nairobi. And because you're in East Africa, you experience kind of your weather is driven by these 2 wet seasons each year. And this is going to be really important. We're going to look at the East African rainy season as the kind of meteorological feature of interest throughout this talk. So as the ITCZ moves kind of north to south and south to north throughout the year, you get these 2 rainy seasons. One called the long rains in March, April, and May, or the MAM rains, I'll abbreviate it in this talk, and then one called the short rains in October, November, and December, the OND rains. And as a farmer, you plant in these 2 rainy seasons. These are kind of your 2 opportunities to grow crops in East Africa. And before you make that planting decision, before each long and short rainy season, you need to make a bunch of decisions. Which crop varietal seeds do you purchase? Do you purchase long or short season maize? When do you make your planting decision? When you do plant, how densely do you space your crops in the field? Tight, dense crops will produce more yield at the end of the season, but they'll also drink more water. And if you have a dry season, too dense planting could cause your crops to fail. If you have extra money in the season to apply fertilizer or apply pesticides, do you purchase those things? And if so, when do you plant them? These are kind of a whole sequence of decisions that a farmer must make each season in these long and short rains. Because you're in Machakos County, you likely grow maize, sorghum, and millet, and then potentially a bunch of other things. You might grow watermelons, tomatoes, and onions to sell at local farmers markets. You might grow things like pigeon peas, which are very drought tolerant. You're in a very warm area, and you have little or no access to irrigation. And so kind of all of this context is going to be really important as we think about how your understanding of the rainy season and the ability to provide enhanced advisories around rainy season onset would affect the way that you act and make decisions on a yearly basis. And so historically, you might go to your local Ministry of Agriculture, CalRO in Kenya, or the Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock Development, and look at when you should plant in this eastern region of Kenya. So in the Machakos region, again, we see here the March, April, May rainy season, the long rains, and then the OND rainy season. The short rains are these kind of 2 opportunities to plant, allow your vegetables to produce, ripen, and harvest. And so potentially you have this calendar in your head, you think to yourself, I'm going to be planting sometime in March and April, or in October and November, and then my crop will ripen throughout the season. And now I'm going to place us in a moment in time. So we've been in space, and now I'm going to take us to a moment in time. It's August 2022. You're approaching the October, November, December short rainy season. You're in East Africa, as I said. So in East Africa, the OND rainy season is a quite significant rainy season. This is the amount of rainfall per year that falls kind of historically over time in East Africa in the short rains. So you can see the OND rains hit this part of Kenya much more than they hit other parts of Kenya. This is just something interesting. If you were a farmer over here or over here, you wouldn't make use, you wouldn't have as substantial of a growing season in the short rains. But in Eastern Kenya, you do. And so you're kind of gearing up to plant. You know this is a significant rainfall season. And let's say you have access to seeds for a short season maize crop. This is a crop that can take kind of minimally around 70 days. And this is an important number to remember, 70 days to reach maturity. This short rainy season is short. It lasts between 60 and 80 days. So you have this very tight window to get your crop in the ground and to get it to maturity before the end of the rainy season. And so you feel this kind of optimistic urgency. If the rains come, you want to get your seed in the ground because you hope it's the beginning of the rainy season and you're going to make the best you can of this very tight window that you have. You're expecting to plant sometime in October or November, but honestly, in recent years, the OND rainy season has been moving around a lot. It hasn't been as predictable. And so you're not as confident about exactly when to plant. And one place you can go to get really useful information about this decision is on September 2nd, 2022. So as we're ramping up and approaching this rainy season, the Kenya Meteorological Department, KMD, will release a seasonal outlook for this season. And so I just took some screenshots of the seasonal outlook from 2022. It's all public and online. And you can see here, if you look at, we're in Machakos County, there's a forecasted probability of below average or highly depressed rainfall for this rainy season. So this forecast comes out, I mean, many smallholder farmers probably won't look at a forecast in a format like this. If you read the full PDF online, there's a lot of kind of wonderful discussion about the El Nino oscillation phase and the MJO and all of these kind of drivers of global physical rainfall and physical phenomena. That's, you know, kind of not the presentation that a farmer would be kind of primed to take in. But let's say you do read this and you look at Machakos County and you see that there's this forecast of highly depressed rainfall, kind of more likely a farm extension worker in your area potentially looks at this forecast and can provide guidance to you. And there's a forecast that the rainy season is going to onset in the first week of November and cease in the 3rd to 4th week of December and have a very poor distribution. And so this is just summarizing that. We get a forecast that the OND rainy season is going to be late, it will be short, and it's going to be between 46 and 60 days long. And if you remember kind of the number that we had in our head about the maturation of my corn seed or my maize seed, I said about 70 days minimum. So this is really a tight rainy season. Seems maybe unlikely that I'll even be able to get a maize crop to maturity. I potentially already have the seeds in hand and will plant anyways, but with this kind of knowledge that this is going to be a very tight season, it's possible that my crop won't make it and I need to get my seeds in the ground as quickly as I can. And this is on over here in 2022, KMD didn't produce a map, but I included the map from 2024. That's kind of given as a season outlook, which gives these different bands in the country of Kenya. Will there be above, below, or depressed rainfall? And what are the kind of relative probabilities of those in the physical simulations that KMD runs? This is just kind of an interesting sense of what a seasonal forecast might look like. But this is the information we have to take to farmers. And so we're kind of primed in Machakos County to be a bit stressed about getting seeds in the ground. It's going to be a short rainy season and it will not be a good distribution of rains. And so September begins. We get a little bit of scattering rain. Now I'm going to show you a sequence of time series plots that will look like this. So I'll take a moment to acclimate everyone to what we're looking at because these are going to kind of go throughout the slides. It's worth understanding what's happening here. So this is a time series on the bottom going from September 2022 until January 2023. This is the kind of full set of months of our rainy season, our short rains, OND rains. On the y-axis here, I'm showing the daily precipitation in millimeters, where each blue dot is a specific day. And so we have daily precipitation, and we're moving forward in time. We've moved through September. We got a few days with rain, but largely we have 0 millimeters of rain in Matagos County. It's very dry. We move even further into October and still no rain. It's completely dry. That's fine. The forecast didn't predict that we would start until the first weeks of November. And these X's here I'm showing you are times that the rainy season has onset in the past. These are historical onsets. So as a farmer, in my working memory, I might have planted in October one year, or here in October a year before. The rains came much earlier in some previous years, and this is kind of in my working memory. But I know that this season, the rains will be late, so I wait. And then kind of at the very last week of October, the first few days of November, the soil is completely parched. It's been dry for many months. But the rain begins. We get our first kind of 4 consecutive days with significant rainfall, 5 to 10 millimeters of rain. And actually, a question I want to pose just to the audience here that I found kind of, it really elucidates how difficult the whole problem of using forecasts and using weather intelligence to drive decision-making in farming is, do you plant? You get a little bit of rain. It's about when the forecast said that the rains would come. The seasonal onlook, you know it's a short season. You're very motivated to get your seed in the ground. I think likely early end of October, early November, I get a bit of rain and I probably put my seeds in the ground. And then what happens is that kind of early burst of rain dries up and you get about 10 days with no substantial rainfall. So if you planted, there's a good chance that your seeds are quite dry at this point. You had very dry soil, a bit of rain, and then a subsequent kind of dry out period. It's possible your seeds would make it through if you did this early planting, but there's a good chance that they might fail to germinate, or that this dry period would result in a loss of seed for you in this season. And so we kind of see the very first problem that weather intelligence services really need to think about. How do you do a good job of forecasting when the rain begins and it's not a good time to plant? So this type of event is something that I want to pay a lot of attention to. We get an early start, and yet it's followed by a subsequent dry spell that could be killing to our crops. And then finally, on November 11th, the rain begins in earnest. So we start to get very dramatic rain, 10 to 20 millimeters a day, and it holds for several weeks. And then kind of holds for the rest of the season. This rain is going to sustain all the way through about December 13th. And then we get another kind of bit of rain at the very end of the rainy season in December 26th. So if I got my crops in the ground sometimes around here, I could have them growing and receiving water all the way through the end of January, or the end of December. And so just to give you the real sense of how hard this problem of agricultural decision-making and using forecasting to improve the decisions that farmers are able to make on the ground, we have to ask this question: when was the optimal time to plant in this season? And I'll show you just one way of thinking about this. There's a lot of different ways of thinking about this that would have to do with measuring the soil moisture, how moist the soil got after rainfall, which has to do with soil type and agroclimatic zone and the way that rain runs off a field, kind of lots of complicated ideas about when the soil is in the right state to plant. But a very simple rule that we can use and that many people do, this was developed by a colleague, John Corbett, at Tomorrow Now, is that whenever the next 11 and 8 days of rain meet specific thresholds, so 40 and 30 millimeters respectively, then there will be enough rain on the soil to kind of wet it to about a hand's depth and be appropriate for planting. So just taking this condition as true for now, we'll look at when the condition is met in our kind of rainy time series. And if we plot these accumulated lines of the 10-day rolling average of rain and the 8-day rolling average of rain, we see that the first time this threshold gets met is right here, where I put this red X. So about the beginning of the first week of November. And we see that this kind of masks out this little early bump of rain. If you planted here, it's likely that the subsequent dry spell would have been bad for your crops. It's better to wait until around here when you're about 11 days out from this big rainy bump get your crops in the ground, and then wait for the rest of the season. And so this is kind of one way that we can analyze historical data and see when we should be making planting decisions and think about how to provide that guidance to farmers moving forward. And so if we look at this onset definition, we can see that the rainy season lasted for about 46 days from November 6th until around December 23rd. And if we go back to our 2022 seasonal outlook, which KMD released, it was actually right on. This was a great forecast. It predicted an O&D rainy season that came late and was short, as we saw, at about between 46 and 60 days long. It ended up being on the short side of that, with onset happening in the second week of November and ceasing in the third week of December. And then to give you just a sense of how difficult and complicated this problem of when to plant is, let's look again at our O&D rainy season in 2019 and compare it to what happened in, on our O&D rainy season in 2022 and compare it to what happened in 2019. So just 3 years ago, the rains came dramatically earlier. So you can see the same type of plot here. Now on the bottom, I'm showing the year 2019, where the rains came heavy and hard all the way back in October, sustained throughout October, had a dry period in early November, and then kicked off again in late November. So I won't comment on exactly whether this season was long enough to plant, whether this dry spell would have been killing, whether you should have waited to hear. But I just want to comment on this kind of very dramatically different character of the rainfall just 3 years earlier. And then I want to zoom out from kind of this slice, which we've been looking at from September to January 2022, and look at the full year. So remember, we have 2 different rainy seasons each year, which we can plant in. The O&D short rains, which we talked about, and then the March, April, May long rains, which we see here for 2022. Totally different, very different character. These kind of bumps of rainfall happening with long interspersed dry spells between them. Be difficult to plant in any of these bumps, followed by kind of the longest and most sustained bump that then is right up against this very dry time in the boreal summer. And then if I go to another year, I'm just going to go back and forth between here. We see if we go again from 2022 to 2019, we saw this dramatic change in character of both the short and long rains. So the short rains are kind of dramatic and heavy in 2019 compared to 2022. If you look on the right side of my screen, and then on the left side of the screen, there was almost no long season rains. And they come in a very different way in 2019 versus 2022. So I'm going to tell you 3 things that I would like you to keep in mind. The first is year-to-year variability. The rainy season changes dramatically from year to year in a way that impacts farming decisions and has a dramatic impact on farming decisions. Now I'm going to return us back to 2022. Let's look at our rainfall plot that we have here. I pulled this data from something called the GPM iMerge rainfall product, which is a satellite-based rainfall product that merges ground-based gauges to come up with an estimate of rainfall in different grid cells around the globe. And so they're estimating, based on the satellite product, the amount of precipitation in this grid cell in Machacos County. I'm going to now flip to Era 5 rainfall. So this is another alternative rainfall product that does the same thing, uses satellite data, but also has a bunch of other physical modeling assumptions, and uses many other data sources to try to estimate what rainfall was falling in that specific grid cell in Kenya. And just as a reference, this Era 5 rainfall product is one of the kind of ground truth standards for training machine learning models to produce rainfall. And you can see this kind of quite dramatic difference between the rainfall that iMerge said fell in Machacos County and the rainfall that Era 5 said fell in Machacos County. So another question I want you to hold in your head here is, how do we measure truth? How do we even know what happened on the ground, such that we can train models to forecast that and give advisories to farmers when we have these kind of dramatic differences between GPM iMerge, one very solid gold standard ground truth source, and Era 5, another very standard gold standard ground truth source. something cool here is even though the absolute magnitude of rainfall that these two models forecast changes dramatically, they actually give you about the same onset date. So whether you use GPM iMerge or ERA5, you forecast that the rainy season started at about the same point. That's important if we think about trying to figure out what actually happened on the ground. And then the final thing I want you to keep in your head here is I'm going to move us from Machakos County in the kind of central eastern region of Kenya to Kisumu County over here in far western Kenya. So here's Machakos County, here's Kisumu County, dramatically different rainfall. You have kind of rains that fall throughout the year. When to plant might not be as big of a problem for you, but runoff could cause big problems if you're trying to apply fertilizer or pesticides, and kind of when the ground is too wet to plant might be a problem that you care about a lot. And I'll just go back and forth here again. Machakos County and Kisumu County, totally different patterns of rainfall in these two counties, a few hundred kilometers away from each other. And so I wanted to walk you through those examples to really ground everyone on the call in kind of the magnitude, the difficulty of the problem facing East African farmers. This East African rainy season drives the livelihoods and lives for millions of farmers. It is difficult to predict, changes dramatically from year to year and very different from place to place. Farmers would substantially benefit from accurate forecasting advisories around rainy season onset and quality. I think there's no question about that. Simply because of this lack of predictability. And the question that I have been thinking about for the last many months is, are today's forecasting models good enough to provide useful advisory for this task? This is a kind of socially important task. It's worth trying to provide good forecasts for it. How good are models today? And I'm thinking about this in a context that I think is really interesting. It's a really interesting moment to think about this type of very specific forecasting problem, because in the last 5 years, as many of you on the call might have seen, AI weather prediction models have done something kind of dramatic. They've gone from an edge fringe idea that some people thought might work to there being a robust set of different modeling architectures out there that are either matching or surpassing the skill of leading numerical weather prediction models, these physics-based models that have been the gold standard for much of my lifetime. And this is the kind of moment of surpassing this green line at 100% skill score is the kind of mark of how good the physical models are. So for years and years, of course, AI models weren't beating that mark. And then kind of starting in 2022, we started to see a slew of models that are kind of able to surpass the performance of the leading numerical weather prediction models. And then some of these models over here on the right side of this plot are kind of new emerging ideas that are playing around with different, basically the way that input data is used in the forecasting model. So GraphDOP and Aardvark make use of much more raw satellite and ground station data versus using more processed reanalysis based products. So these are kind of like playing with different ideas in the space of how to make models more robust and specific. But this is kind of an exciting, interesting trend that's happening. And this is a figure from Stephen Rasp, who runs the WeatherBench project at Google Research and has been kind of actively monitoring and evaluating models since they come out. Now, there's a ton of super important caveats here. This is a evaluation that's done at pretty coarse resolution, 1.5 by 1.5. It's focused on very short time scales. This is a 3-day forecast, largely on temperature evaluation, which, as I'll talk about later, is a lot easier than precipitation. And a lot of these models use physics-based reanalysis products. So they're not kind of separate from the physics-based models as their training data. But still, I think kind of the big takeaway is that we're in a moment where AI models are able to emulate or even slightly surpass the performance of physics-based models. And the landscape of weather prediction is, as I've said a couple times, totally changing. It's opening. We're going from a single player paradigm, where singles in quotes, there are several large numerical modeling centers around the world that derive, improve, and run big physics simulations in the atmosphere, ocean, and land around the Earth to produce forecasts. kind of the two big names here are ECMWF, the European model, and NOAA, the US model. And they run these models on bespoke supercomputers, supercomputing centers that cost quite a bit of money per year to run. This is really the system that existed for so long, to a system where we have a proliferation of public and private models coming from, I'm sure that I'll insult many people with all the logos that I had to leave out of this, because just in the last 3 to 4 years, private companies have started around specific forecasting ideas. Academics are exploring new modeling architectures and producing models and benchmarks, and research institutions are even producing operational forecasts. So there's a lot of kind of exciting models in the public and private sectors that have emerged in the last few years. And a lot of these make use of new open source data and new open source tools for processing that data that enable you to do things like massive geospatial compute directly on your laptop or by using a cloud backend. And I really wanted to highlight this last bit because I hope that it's exciting and relevant to the AfroClimate AI folks. The tools are so cool. I mean, I built this whole benchmark in XArray and Dask. I've never felt kind of more powerful and able to deal with terabytes of geospatial data. I think we are really at a moment where the open source tools, and they're all open source tools, these open source tools are enabling us to deal with data that could only have been processed on supercomputers in the past, right on our laptops, really get a feel for that data, try out different models. And this is, I think, really one of the things that's driving all of these private and public companies and researchers to be able to explore these ideas, is that the open source tools are kind of exciting and next. So I'd be excited to talk to people who are interested in thinking about how we can make these tools more accessible and usable, because they are really powerful. And even given kind of all that excitement and hope for having more actors playing more freely in the space of forecasting, I think that's actually really important, because there are a lot of forecasting problems that we haven't solved yet. And this East African rainy season onset really does sit in a blind spot for many existing AI or numerical weather prediction models. It requires forecasts on the S2S timescales, the subseasonal to seasonal timescales. So you want to know what crop to plant and when to plant up to months and down to weeks in advance. Getting kind of an advisory 1 day in advance is useful, but not the most useful thing here. So really, this is a subseasonal to seasonal prediction problem, which has just been hard for both numerical and AI models for a long time, getting out beyond this 10-day limit, which is really what we think of as short and medium-term forecasting. We have to think about forecasts that are spatially specific. This rainy season onset varied dramatically from Machakos to Kisumu. You cannot think about a rainy season onset for the country of Kenya. It doesn't make sense. And really, I'm actually not sure what the right scale is to think about this problem. This is something that I've been exploring. Is 1.5 by 1.5 degree forecast good enough at 150 kilometers? Do we need to go all the way down to something like 4 kilometers, which would put a pin on a very specific farm? But there's a lot of spatial locality and spatial scales that matter here. This is a problem that's rain dependent, and I just want to highlight that rain is hard. It's different than temperature. It's different than other phenomena. It actually requires you to do things like model convective rainfall in the tropics, which is a very kind of different and difficult meter. It's very patchy and sparse. It's hard to train on. It's hard to make forecasts for. It's hard to measure and get good ground truth for, as we saw in this Era 5 iMerge problem. And so just rain is really important for agriculture, and rain is hard for models today. And then finally, really importantly, Africa is a low data environment. There's just orders of magnitude less publicly available ground station and radar data on the African continent. There are kind of privately held governmental data sets that are used, for example, in that KMD forecast that we saw. But if we think about kind of a public community that's developing models, training models, more accessible weather intelligence, democratization, there just isn't much publicly available data to do that with. And so we need to think about what quality can we expect from models with very limited ground station data, for example. And so the project that I've been working on is really trying to get as quantitative and specific at asking this question as possible. Do existing numerical and AI-based weather prediction models produce usable East African rainy season forecasts? And it's a hairier question than you might imagine. This word usable really hides a lot in it. So is it timely? Is it accurate? Is it confident? Is it well calibrated? There's a lot of questions about whether or not a farmer could make use of a forecast of rainy season onset, and I'll get into that a little bit, but I'd be excited to share what we've learned around this. And I'll just show you kind of the way that I'm thinking about this problem. We have agricultural decision-making, which is done and supported by a lot of different organizations, but I'll just put for a placeholder here, the CalRO Agricultural Research Organization in Kenya, which does a lot of work directly with farmers through their extension offices for doing things like translating seasonal outlooks into advisories for farmers. And then you have forecast model development. So again, a lot of groups involved in this, but I'll put here the Kenya Met Department, KMD, which takes physical models run on a global scale, low resolution, high resolution models run locally, the data that they have, and produce an outlook like what we saw, the seasonal outlook. And really, there's hope that that forecast model development will feed into and improve agricultural decision-making, and then the feedback from the decisions that agricultural farmers are making, or agricultural organizations are making about how good the forecast was, how well it served their needs, will feed back into the model development process. But I would say actually that this loop, if I could visualize kind of an X here, often doesn't happen. It's like a real one-way street from forecast model development to agricultural decision-making. And in part, this is just because of the way that forecasts have historically been produced, really in these large supercomputers in the US and Europe, then being given as an input to KMD to be refined and tuned and then given down to CalRO. This process just doesn't leave a lot of room for loop closures. But you did see, quite a bit of effort from KMD put into making that seasonal forecast as useful as possible for farmers. But the first thing I'm going to add to this loop is what really is my focus at RISA. How do we build locally relevant task-specific benchmarks that can do a better job of priming this loop, making sure that information is flowing between these different systems? So can we derive task specifications from local agricultural use cases? Can we get those task specifications, translate them into the language of loss functions, machine learning, model development to improve forecasting models? And then I'll just say here, if we just keep this loop moving from A to B to C, there's a high risk of developing a virtuous cycle where we're training around one of these imperfect data products like ERA5 or iMerge, which you've already seen have quite a bit of disagreement between them. What do we kind of call ground truth for priming this cycle? And so there's this really important injection of local data into the system. So we need to think about how do we get curated data sets for training that are as accurate as possible, and then what do we use for verification in a benchmarking exercise? What is the right ground truth to use? And this is something that that KMD, who operates a large network of stations in Kenya, and other organizations do kind of need to be involved in and thinking about how to make the best use of local data for model development and benchmarking. And so this is kind of the system as it existed today, and then that's grown over the last many years with the support of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. This is really like a zoom out view of a program that the Gates Foundation is developing and kind of adding in different actors to different parts of these components. So, for example, working with Salient Predictions, a private company that produces S2S forecasts to try to think about, can we really drive forward the kind of going from ECMWF numerical models to AI-based forecasting products, and thinking about how to do that. There's other actors involved in this agricultural decision-making organization and kind of thinking about other sources of local data. The TAMO network is this really exciting kind of nonprofit based in Kenya that does local data collection. Windborne System is an organization that releases weather balloons, trying to think about kind of how to flesh out this full loop picture. And so I'll just briefly show you the really the MVP of what we've built around this idea of using benchmarking to pump the prime between agricultural tasks and model development. And I'm going to do that. I'll just very briefly mention that this is based on two different, kind of inspired by two different projects that are really relevant. Google Research's WeatherBench project, which does these scorecards for short-term weather forecasting and benchmarks them along traditional kind of ML AI metrics, and then Columbia and UCLA's Chaos Bench project, which does the same thing for S2S forecasts. And I'm going to share my screen to do this because I think it would be cool for it to be interactive. Oh, I'll just mention one more thing to prime us as we go into this benchmarking demo. There are really kind of two models that you should have in your head, almost as like main characters in a benchmarking exercise. Climatology, or long-term normals, or historical norms, or whatever you want to call this. This is a quote model that just looks at for every grid cell in a specific, for every specific grid cell over the last 10, 20, 30 years, what was the average temperature or precipitation on a specific day of year for that grid cell, and uses that as its estimate for what will happen next year or the year after that. So if on April 1st, there's been on average over the last 30 years, maybe 10 millimeters of rainfall in this specific grid cell in Kenya, I will use that as my forecast for every April 1st going forward. And you can see that that would look very different on August 1st. So this climatology is a very simple baseline, which is actually sometimes surprisingly hard to beat for forecasting models. And this is really one of the markers that we should be using in a benchmarking evaluation. If you can't do better than climatology, your model has questionable value. I really think this is the pin on the bottom that we need to be using. And then the numerical model to beat is something called ECMWF IFS for subseasonal timescales extended range. This is the kind of top performing physics-based model globally. It's produced at 1.5 by 1.5 degree grid cells and goes all the way out to 6 weeks. And this is what, for example, feeds a lot of KMD's seasonal outlooks. This is provided to Met departments around the globe. And you can see this is just a picture of the bias of the ECMWF ER model around the globe. If on average over time, is the model too wet or too dry? You can see some bias challenges in Africa already. Too wet in the Congo, too dry in a bunch of parts of the continent. And so I'll just try to show you the system a bit live. And this is something that we're working on and are excited to kind of share and think about how to build as a useful tool for the community. It has 4 different features right now: a metrics overview table, which is like the WeatherBench scorecards, maps of metrics, a specific suitable planting window exploration around this when to plant decision that I talked about at the beginning of the talk, and then this question of how different sources of rainfall data compare to each other over time and in different specific regions. So we're looking at station data quality versus reanalysis in this bit. And so I'll just kind of click through a bit here. You can see the kind of classic AI scorecard for temperature and precipitation here for 3 different types of climatological models. So it's like a really standard climatology and then 2 enhanced climatologies, the ECMWF extended range forecast, which I talked about, and that forecast after operational debiasing. So doing some simple debiasing on that model, which would be done to correct some of the systemic biases that you saw there. Like if it's always wet over the Congo, it's easy to correct some of that signal out just by subtracting a constant or adding a constant. And then an AI weather prediction forecasting model that I'll put as a stand-in here. And so this scorecard has 2 colors, red and blue. Red means that you're performing worse than the baseline, which I've selected here to be climatology. Like I said, I think we always need to be doing better than climatology to have value. And then blue means you're performing better than climatology. And then each column here is a week further in the future. So if I asked you what's going to happen 1 week from now, that's what this column is: 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, and 6 weeks. And you can see performance degrading as you get out to 6 weeks. This is mean absolute error I'm showing here. smaller is better, MAE grows quite substantially as you try to predict further and further in the future. And so this is in units of Celsius. And then over here, we have millimeters of rainfall. And so you can just see how performance changes by model and over time. And one of the things that we added here, just based on a desire to be able to do more localized benchmarking, is that you can look at how this forecast performs globally. You can look at forecasters in the continental United States, and you can look at forecasts in East Africa. And so this was really this idea that you could toggle back and forth between different regions of the globe and see whether or not the model errors looked different in different regions. And then we implemented a bunch of different metrics here. Mean absolute error for deterministic forecasts, CRPS for probabilistic forecasts. I'll show you bias here. I think it's interesting. Are the models too dry or too wet, too hot or too cold on average? And then for the sake of time, I want to show you, for example, if we care not just about Africa as a whole, we might say, okay, well, models are too wet in Africa. What's happening here? I can click on this specific lead, and it will take me to a map of that forecast and that lead. So ECMWF biased here for week 2 at a 1.5 grid cell in Africa, and I can zoom in on some of the spatial patterns that might elucidate kind of what's happening around this bias. And then I can switch out to, for example, the unbiased corrected model here if I want. And then if I go back home, oops, sorry, I've potentially frozen my demo. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, if I go back home here, I'll show you, I mean, really one interesting takeaway from this first scorecard-based metric was that it's interesting to see the millimeters of rainfall that a model has in error, 6 millimeters at week 5 on average, 4 millimeters at week 1 on average, but that doesn't really tell me whether or not a model is better or worse for rainy season onset forecasting in a meaningful way. And so to explore that question, we developed this suitable planting window demo, which is what I used to make a bunch of the slides that I talked about today. So you can click on specific grid cells in Kenya. This is just implemented in Kenya, and look at what the rainy season character was in that forecast. And then the thing that we've added to that I didn't show in the slides was being able to see what the ECMWF model predicted over time for that specific year. What was the probability of onset forecasted by the ECMWF model over time? And you can see it giving kind of very high probability of onset around this specific onset, and then very low probability of onset around this specific onset, which makes sense. This is maybe kind of barely an onset. And you can explore that in different parts of Kenya and just see how variable the rainy season is and how good the forecasting model is at predicting that in advance. And kind of distilling this into another scorecard metric for rainy season onset is something that I'm working on right now, so that instead of just having this kind of visual exploration, we can get some quantitative metrics around forecast performance on onset. And you can also switch here between ERA 5 as your ground truth source, iMerge, or yeah, those are really the two features that work well. ERA 5 onset. And then the last thing I'll show you is kind of digging into that question here. What makes sense to use as a ground truth data source, especially for rainfall in Africa? This is a map that shows you here every green or every purple cell is a 1.5 by 1.5 degree grid cell in Africa. Every cell that has a green demarcation has a publicly available GHCN ground station in it. So if I zoom in here in Kenya, I can click again in our Machakos County grid cell here. If I click that, I see a time series of ERA 5, iMerge, and CHIRPS. These are the 3 primary rainfall products over Africa, as well as what that ground station reported over time. And so I can look at that daily, or I can look at that weekly. And if I zoom in here on my weekly average values, actually let me do 2022 because that's when we were looking at in the slides. So we can see this September 2022. Well, actually, I'll zoom in because I think that this will be interesting. Yeah, so here's the year 2022. We see the March, April, May rains, and then we see the October, November, December rains, which we looked at before OND. This station did not have good precipitation data for the OND rains. And so you could imagine trying to use this station to evaluate how well these different sources of ground truth predicted the actual value of rainfall at that station in these rains. And then this really exemplifies there's quite a bit of missing data in these time series and sparsity in this data that makes it difficult to evaluate. And it's just missing for the OND rainy season. And so I'll just end there. There's a lot more that I could show you and talk about, but I really want to leave time for questions, and I made some slides that just walked through that. But this kind of SheerWater benchmarking exercise is something I'm working on with a bunch of different partners from all over the world, and would be really excited to talk to you about. RISA is a nonprofit. We're really interested in sharing data, knowledge, and skills as openly and as broadly as we can in collaborating with different efforts to do benchmarking, like the ones that are happening at AfriClimate AI, and kind of accelerating this process of democratization of forecasting as much as possible. So if you have questions, thoughts, or ideas, please reach out to me. I put my email here. I would really love to hear from you. And I would like to save, some time at the end here for questions if there are any. I'm happy to kind of go back to the dashboard and look at specific things or answer general questions, whatever is useful.
Thank you very much, Genevieve, for the insightful presentation. So it's time for questions. You can either raise your hand and unmute yourself to speak, or put your question in the chat. In the meantime, Amal, do you have any announcement while we wait if someone has a question?
John, I don't know. I have a question. I'm struggling to raise my hand. I don't know if okay, no, I just haven't used Zoom in a while. Thanks for the talk, Genevieve. It was really quite interesting. I just wanted to find out your experience with sort of GHCN. I mean, what is sort of the temporal coverage? Is the quite significant missing data? Is it because we on our side as well, we're struggling with what do you use to evaluate this? Is it an interaction of TAMO and GHCN, or in terms of how complete is the GHCN data?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say you could click around this dashboard, and I'd be happy to show this with you, Randani. These are the only cells that there are GHCN stations in. And then, for example, when the rainy season hits East Africa, what's happening over Madagascar is really important. And if you look at Madagascar itself, you can see this is from 2016 to 2024, different stations and their coverage over time. So this is a station that had no data, the orange dots here, from 2016 all the way up to 2022, and then came back online and has been producing consistently, but had some kind of significant gaps here maybe in 2024, went offline. And then there are kind of stations here that have much worse records. This is a very spotty station over time. And I think just clicking around here, there is really this question of how to measure truth. I think getting like millimeters a day specifically is going to be really challenging, because there's big divergences between ERA5, iMerge, and CHIRPS in their millimeters a day, and then there aren't really the stations to back that up. I think in partnership with things like IRI and ACTS that have worked in partnership with National Met Services across the continent to get access to their kind of much more substantial stores of governmentally held data to do validation exercises like this. That's a really interesting model. But the kind of publicly available station data, I think, is very limited.
maybe I don't know if I'm causing traffic in terms of questions, but if you look at your data sources, do you think is there significant change in decisions that a user would make had they used a different set of ground truth for particular use cases in S2F?
Yeah, and that's the really cool question. That was what motivated the whole suitable planting window exploration, was basically that, you know, I wanted to be able to flip back and forth between iMerge and Era 5 here and see, okay, they forecast different levels of rain, but do they give the same onset date? And I think for some grid cells, I would say very consistent onset date from Era 5 and iMerge. And then I've seen examples of dramatically the opposite. Like I think maybe it was up here. Well, yeah, I can try to find, but I think there are examples where there's enough divergence between Era 5 and iMerge, where actually like one, it never rains in the season, and in one there's a kind of a dramatic period where you could plant. So I would say both are true, but there's definitely more convergence between the different data sources when you look at big events like onset. And that's important to think about as we train models for specific tasks.
Okay, I see that we have a question from Mina Lisco. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Depending on where you are, good day, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Genevieve. I found that it was very, very interesting, especially that you're highlighting the challenge with the ground truthing. So I have two questions. On the ground truthing, from what I can see, you've presented two comparisons or sources, but they were both satellite-derived information. Is there a network of ground stations, and do you know what is the distance between the ground stations for the ground truthing? And then the other question is around, so the focus here is towards your smallholder farmers. So how do you relay this information to the smallholder farmer? I'm particularly looking at, as it is like you share on the screen now, it has appearance of being scientific with the graphs and such. So how do you get it down to the common man on the ground to apply? Thank you.
Those are good questions, Mina. I'll maybe answer them just quickly here. So these, everything green here is a cell with a publicly available GHCN ground station in it. So this is kind of more or less the distribution of public stations on the continent. There's some, of course, like within each of these cells, they're 100 kilometers wide. There are specific, sometimes multiple stations. But this is kind of about the spatial distribution. And we did look at these three different products that are all kind of merged station satellite products. So CHIRPS is a well-known one that uses stations and climatologies and satellites to try to come up with a precipitation estimate. iMerge is more raw satellite, and then Era 5 is, of course, satellite plus physics modeling and many other sources. But yeah, I think there are interesting differences in strengths and weaknesses between these. And I would love to follow up with you if you wanted to talk more about that. I think I've learned a lot just in this first part of benchmarking. And your second question, I don't actually do that myself, but I do work with the team. I'll highlight Tomorrow Now as a nonprofit, and then CalRO, the Kenyan Agricultural Research Organization, as two really strong partners that have worked on how to kind of distill all of this information into basically SMS text messages that go out to farmers. And I think there's a bunch of tremendous research on this. Like, I've seen examples in Ethiopia of billboards that are put up with information in different formats, running trials with farmers about what that information should look like and how it should be structured. It's a super complicated question. And I'm honestly not fully the expert in it. But I think I'm excited to work with groups that are trying to do that, to think about how to distill kind of scientific insights in a benchmarking exercise into decisions about which models should be provided to farmers, for example. And I know, yeah, organizations like KMD spend a lot of time thinking about that and working on that. I can answer a question from the chat.
Yeah.
So this onset forecast is really just rainfall based, I think. And
for
it's
the
not
people who would,
oh,
sorry, Genevieve.
yes,
For
please,
the
John.
people
Yeah,
who would
help me
watch
here.
the video later, could we read the question for them to be sure of what's
Absolutely.
happening? So Nachikita, she says, Genevieve, great talk, Genevieve. Just wonder, can you tell what specific agency under CGI is involved in this project? Does ICPAC is IPAC involved in the project? Also, what definition on onset you are using here? Agronomic or something? Thanks.
I'll go in reverse order because that would be my easiest. So the definition of onset that I'm using here is purely rainfall based. How much rain fell over an 11 and 8 day period. I mean, I've talked to the folks who've developed this model extensively. I think there's a bunch of other factors like soil type, soil moisture, temperature, whether or not this kind of like killing dry spell will be hot, that could go into an onset model, kind of more and more complicated models of when onset happens and then when the best time to plant is. And of course, there are other kind of atmospheric indicators around ITCZ and onset progression. This is a very simple how much rain fell onset model that I think gets at a lot of the interesting signal in this problem. I'm not, maybe Nashi, I can follow up with you on the other two questions. That would be
good. Okay. There is also Renel who says, please go ahead. He's unsure how to raise his hand.
Thank you, John.
You can ask your question.
Yes, this is Reynal. Thank you, Genevieve. Very interesting talk. I have a little background in the object, but it was very pedagogical. So I'm grateful for that. Okay, so I have two questions, maybe three. The first question is about what you call the ground truth. What I understand is that this is a benchmark that you want to use to like validate or not these computations. How about using the predictions of the best local farmer? Because this farmer is on the ground. Hopefully he has been doing well not too well, but at least he's performing better than his peers. How about using his own predictions as a benchmark? And this is just a naive idea. Where would that fail? The second question I have is about how do you say this thing? Researchers, like, okay, this is great, and there are young researchers on the continent, and like, how do you get these tools in their hands also? Like, because then it makes them less reliant and more like, okay, and especially researchers, like young people, like get this into their training and stuff like that. So how do you think about that? And finally, when I'm thinking about these rains that like I see the first rain and maybe if I plant it, later on there is no rain, so maybe I waste my crop. I'm thinking if I have a storage of water and maybe like there's a lot of underground water in these spaces, I can just use the underground water as a storage and pump it out when there isn't in the, how do you say, in the valley of precipitation. I can use my storage to fill the valley. Like this is techniques that people use elsewhere from electricity, which is my background. Like how do I do when I don't have enough electricity? So those were my three questions. Thank you very much.
Those are great questions, Janelle. First question about using the best farmer. I think that's something that's deeply interesting. When did people actually plant and what were the outcomes? I like that idea of a specific representative that has kind of been successful season to season. It's just, I mean, it's much harder data to collect for me. And I know there are folks on this call and who I've been working with who do kind of large surveys of farmers. To try to get that information, you would have to do it season to season in a concerted way. But there's a lot of richness in that data for kind of correcting models like this that I would be interested in kind of seeing and supporting. Your second, and I mean, I think it can be dramatically different. People might plant at very different times, and whether or not a crop makes it through one of these dry spells and whether this was the right time to plant or not does have a lot to do with conditions on the ground that we can't see. So that's just some humility there. I think your second question about getting tools like this into the hands of researchers on the continent, yeah, I am so excited about that. I do think that most of these data sets are open source. This is actually 100% built. Actually, this whole dashboard is 100% built with open source tools. Open source data sets. Grafana is an open source dashboarding system. The libraries we use to compute all the metrics are open source themselves. That's really rich and exciting. I think it opens the doors for folks. I do think kind of capacity building, training, one of the ways that we help young researchers make use of these new geospatial tools and get trained on them is, something that Africlam AI works on, thinks about quite deeply, that I'm excited to empower. Because I think it will be powerful when many, many people, when like you can just look at the forecasting performance in the locality where you are, try to improve it, run some of these models, see whether they work or not. And if there are young researchers who would like to kind of be involved, collaborate with me in any way, use this in a training exercise, I'd be really excited to talk to folks about that. And then third question, which I've forgotten. Maybe can someone prompt me quickly?
Yes, thank you. Very nice response. The third question was about like the time to plant. Like if I plant when there's early rains and then rain stops, if I have underground water storage, I can just use water storage. Yes.
Irrigation, which I think from my understanding is not present in many areas that we work in with smallholder farmers in Kenya, would help tremendously. I mean, look at the character of this spotty March, April, May rainy season. There are some dry spells here, which if you could kind of chain together bits of rain potentially would really change the character of the growing season. I don't know much about that, so I won't speak largely on kind of the viability of irrigation as a solution to some of these challenges. But it is interesting given the character of these rains. And then the other thing I'll just say is, my collaborator who works on the suitable planting window model told me really the way of thinking about a forecast is not telling you when the rains will come, because people can kind of see that themselves. But when not to plant, when do the rains seem like they're coming, but actually there'll be a dry spell that will kill your crops? Can you provide advance warning of that kind of phenomena, that the rains appear to have come, but that they will dry out, that there is going to be a valley and that you should not plant? And I think that kind of prediction of the valleys is really one of the focuses for me of developing AI models for this.
Thank you very much. Very nice talk.
Yeah, thank you for your good questions. And I'll quickly answer one of the questions on the chat around replicating this in another country. It would be very easy. Yeah, I would be excited if there's a use case for doing some of this analysis elsewhere. It would be like 2 lines of code for me, actually. Pretty easy. I mean, my focus is in Kenya, but I would be happy to run a similar model elsewhere. I will say that what rainy season onset looks like in different countries and what are the right kind of thresholds for different land types could be dramatically different. So there would need to be some knowledge there.
There's also Jose Kimani.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me. I'm
Yes,
Desire. I'm Desire from Kenya, but currently studying in AIMS, South Africa, and actually working on the climate, how to use AI in climate. And I'm interested in 3 questions, and this is amazing work that you've done. To start with, we have in Africa we have an overall data insufficiency as a result of underreporting or sparsely distributed weather stations. How do you reconcile or extrapolate now this missing data, even as you consider this benchmark? Maybe you can touch around that. And then secondly, we all know that, okay, most people know that Era 5 data has a bias on precipitation. So I've seen you're using Era 5 data here. Do you take into consideration about the bias that it has? And then thirdly, it's about the skill scores that you have used. I've seen when so you have a number of them. You have RMSC, you have SEC, and I've also seen you have CRPS. Maybe you can mention why you used this and considered these skill scores, and are they sufficient enough in benchmarking weather models? Thank you so much.
Thank you for those questions. Yeah. So I'll answer the first one. That's question about stations. Again, I think this is one of the most challenging questions in making useful forecasting models for Africa is how do you deal with ground station scarcity, and not really just ground station scarcity, but then how does that ground station scarcity impact the quality of global gridded data products, which I do think, you know, there's different pathways for information to flow into models, but that like iMerge satellite-based rainfall is calibrated with stations. If you have few stations, that calibration is of lower quality. I think kind of thinking about that process of improving our gridded data products with station scarcity is a kind of a science problem, or at least it feels like a machine learning project engineering problem. It seems unsolved to me. And it really important. And I think, you know, collaborating with local Met agencies that have access to a broader range of station data is a really important action to take there. That's also logistically complicated. And so I think thinking about mechanisms for federated data access and federated data sharing of the data that is available is something I'm kind of interested in. And then, but I don't have good answers for you there. I will say the iMerge and Era 5 I'm looking at both. Era 5 being known to have this rainfall bias of kind of like slow dripping over the season rather than maybe like correctly forecasting large convective events. iMerge being a more satellite-based measurement product, but having its own weaknesses. And then I'm not doing a good job of remembering the second questions. It's Josiah. I'm sorry about that.
The second question is about Era 5 in terms of the bias that it has in terms of precipitation. Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, we've definitely seen that. I mean, you can even look at some of these traces. I won't, but you can see Era 5's kind of like muted, low rainfall all the time bias in a lot of these conditions.
The third one is about the skill scores that you have used. So you used RMSC, you also used anomaly correlation coefficient, and also used CRPS. So I just need to know, are they sufficient skill scores for this benchmark?
No, I don't believe so. I mean, that was our first stab. Our next stab is going to include a bunch of more event-based, so probability of detection, false alarm rate for large rainfall events, for example. I think that kind of looking at how, not whether you got the millimeters of rain right exactly, but whether or not you're getting small, medium, and large rainfall event detections correct is one step that we're taking, and thinking kind of, yeah, enriching the set of metrics from these millimeters of rainfall based things to trying to kind of more capture qualitatively what matters to a farmer on the ground about the character of rain, specifically for rain, thinking a lot about metrics like that.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, I'm beginning to be conscious about the time. I see two hands are up. I would take one question from Amar Geba, and then Amar would go last. And any other thing else could follow up with the speaker later. I think we've run out of time. So Amar Gabe.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I will be very short. Thank you for the presentation. Very informative presentation. I'm looking for this work as the useful tool for the researcher. So I'm expect to have the a recommendation out of it because we are have to deliver this or translate this to the farmers because to do this to do their decision making depend on that. So I'm saying this because my background is agrometeorology. Actually, I'm interested in Sudan, and we have very challenges regarding the identifying the onset in virus part of the country. And I think you know this is carrying for the most country of Africa. Now I'm running a company, a consultation company, and I want to find it or explore any opportunity of collaboration because this work is valuable for us. And if possible, we can replicate it in Sudan. And now, even I'm working with Sudan Meteorological Authority, so we can replicate this. Yeah, my question is how to translate this benchmark outcome to the farmers to support their decision making, and how to explore collaboration opportunity to replicate this in Sudan. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Amar. And please, I put my email here on the slide. Feel free to reach out to me. I would be curious to hear more about that use case and whether or not there's support or guidance learned from this experience that could be useful there. And I'll say this is kind of an ongoing project. Some version of this will come out as public information. Whether it be a memo, a report, a paper, or an open source dashboard, I'm not sure yet. I'm kind of just trying to figure out what would be the most useful to the community and possible for me to maintain. So just keep posted. Go ahead, Amal.
Okay, I'm out.
Yes.
You are muted, Amal.
Oh, not muted, but I can't hear you.
No.
Oh,
Yeah, I'm hearing you. Yeah. Okay. This is cool. I will communicate you concerning the collaboration.
Okay, so the names are similar and it's quite. I'm
Okay,
now talking
sorry.
about the other Amal, Namush.
Okay.
You are muted, I think. Otherwise, I can't hear you.
Yeah, I
No.
don't think we hear you, Amal. If you put your, oh,
Can you hear me now?
yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So I was just saying thank you for staying with us so long, and I'll conclude. So I was thinking, like, if we want to leverage the insights from your work and the dashboard to improve the decision making, whether for farming or other applications, where do you think like the efforts should be put or prioritized? Like, is it in deploying more weather stations or focusing on model development, or collecting more localized data? So
yeah, I think that is the question of my life right now. I feel really kind of deeply thinking about, each of these pieces has its own challenges. Each of the every system has its perfections and imperfections, and then the links themselves are kind of clogged in different ways. And if you can put energy into ensuring that information flows well in this system and that each individual piece is as robust as possible, where do you place attention and time and effort?
And money.
Yeah, really money, to do things like invest in local stations. So the project is kind of actually trying a bunch of different things, investing in local data and model development and benchmarking and in ag decision making at the same time, and trying to think about, for me, I'm just trying to have a view, and I don't have a good answer, but I maybe will have more insight in a year, and I think the field really needs to kind of know this. Like, there's a sense, are the models good enough? I'm not sure. Is the data good enough to support the models? I'm not sure. Are they good enough if you constrain it to just rainy season onset? You don't have to do well at precipitation everywhere. You just have to be able to forecast the rainy season. My hope is that benchmarking can really drive us to scientifically answer those questions. at least beginning to have some comparison of the error in data, the error in models, and then the performance around specific tasks.
The efforts should be on benchmarking right now, basically, in order to find those answers, maybe.
For me, I think because we don't know the answers to that as a community, yes, like really thinking about them in a rigorous way. And I think benchmarking is, easier than any of these three other things. So I don't want to make everyone focus. I mean, all of these components are really hard, but I think benchmarking can provide us some of the oversight that we need kind of scientifically as a community to know where to focus efforts and money.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, John, then we can conclude.
Yeah, I think Amal, you can just conclude.
Yeah. So thank you, Genevieve, for the talks, and thank you so much for staying along with us. This was very interesting, and we look forward to working with you. And if anyone has follow-up question or anything, please, reach out to either Genevieve directly or on our community channel. Thank you.
Thank you so much for hosting me and for all of the lovely questions. I rarely get so many wonderful questions in talks, so that made me really happy. Thank you, everyone, for engaging.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye, everyone.
Bye.